Rick and Morty has been running for more than 10 years, and it has never once stopped to clean up after itself. A man with no name and no past walked into a family's life in Season 2, and the show never explained where he came from. A civilization was born, grew old, built gods and wars and entire philosophies, and collapsed into dust inside a storage unit in Rick's garage, while a football game played in the next room. A Morty, who had been used and discarded one too many times, built something patient and devastating across 4 seasons, and then walked out of the only universe designed to hold him through a yellow door into a place the show has never returned to. A dead snake in outer space produced time-traveling snake assassins. A 6-month freeze split reality in half, and the cracks are still there. Tonight, we are walking through every unsolved mystery, every broken timeline, every question this show buried and never came back for. Welcome to Ricktopus. Let us begin. The man behind the flask. Rick's alcoholism, depression, and the pain he never admits. There is a moment in the very first season of Rick and Morty that most people laugh at and then forget. It happens at a party in the Smith family garage. Rick is doing what Rick always does at parties, which is drink, be loud, and make everyone around him feel slightly uncomfortable. His old friend Bird Person pulls Morty aside quietly and says something that stops the whole scene cold. He tells Morty that Rick's catchphrase, the one Rick shouts constantly throughout the show, the silly-sounding wubba-lubba-dub-dub, is not nonsense. In Bird Person's language, it means something specific. It means, I am in great pain. Please help me. The show plays it as a small moment. Rick does not hear it. The party continues. Nothing changes. But that sentence, tucked into the middle of a Season 1 episode called Ricksy Business, is quietly one of the most important things the show ever said. Because it tells you, right at the beginning, that everything you are watching Rick perform is a performance. The confidence, the chaos, the drinking, the cruelty disguised as wit, all of it is sitting on top of something much heavier that Rick has never once allowed to surface directly. Understanding Rick Sanchez as a character means understanding that he is not simply a genius who drinks. He is a person in profound pain who has organized his entire life around never having to feel that pain directly. The drinking is not a personality quirk. The show is careful across many seasons to make that distinction visible if you are paying attention. In the episode Rick Potion number 9, when Morty is devastated by the consequences of what he and Rick have done to their world, Rick tells him simply that the best way to deal with horrible outcomes is to not think about it, not process it, not grieve, just not think about it. That is not a coping strategy. That is the absence of one. And Rick has been applying that absence to his own life for decades. The show first starts building this picture slowly and carefully. Bird Person's translation of Wubba Lubba Dub Dub is the earliest signal, but the signals accumulate. In the episode Big Trouble in Little Sanchez from Season 2, Rick transfers his consciousness into a younger version of himself to help the family deal with a vampire at a school. The young clone, Tiny Rick, is cheerful and popular and everything the real Rick projects to the outside world. But something keeps bleeding through. Tiny Rick starts drawing pictures that disturb people around him. He improvises song lyrics that are openly about being trapped and wanting to escape. His subconscious keeps reaching through the surface because the real Rick, the one buried underneath the performance, is desperate and cannot stop himself from asking for help even when the conscious version of him refuses to. The show draws a clean line between the Rick who faces the world and the Rick who exists beneath it. They are not the same person. They have not been the same person for a very long time. What makes this particular aspect of Rick so affecting is that the show never makes it sentimental. Rick does not sit down and explain his pain. He does not have a breakdown where everything comes out neatly. The writers understand that people who have carried grief for decades do not suddenly unpack it in a single conversation. Instead, they keep moving. They make themselves indispensable. They fill every quiet moment with noise because quiet is where the grief lives. Rick fills his quiet with alcohol and interdimensional adventure and an almost manic need to always be doing something, solving something, blowing something up. Stillness is dangerous for him. Stillness is where the feelings are. The alcohol itself is worth slowing down for because the show treats it differently across its seasons. In the early episodes, it reads as comedic. Rick is the eccentric drunk genius, and the flask is part of the visual shorthand for who he is. But as the show reveals more of Rick's history, the drinking starts carrying different weight. When the Season 5 finale, Rick Mirai Jack, finally gives audiences a proper look at Rick's past, at what happened with his wife Diane and his daughter Beth, and the version of himself who killed them both, there is a sequence showing Rick in the aftermath of that loss. He is alone. He has failed to get revenge, and he starts drinking, not as a joke, not as a character trait, as the only thing left to do when everything else is gone. That is the moment moment where the show commits to a reading of Rick's alcoholism that goes well beyond the surface. He did not start drinking because he is a genius and geniuses drink. He started drinking because something happened to him that broke him in a way he never found a way to repair. The alcohol came first as grief management. Then it became habit. Then it became identity. By the time the show begins, Rick has been carrying this for so long that he cannot separate the drinking from himself anymore. It is not a phase of his life. It is the shape his life took after the worst thing happened. The show also gives Rick one of the most honest depression arcs in animated television, and it does it almost entirely without using the word depression. In the episode Autoerotic Assimilation from Season 2, Rick reconnects with an ex-lover, a hive mind entity called Unity who can control entire populations. While Rick is with Unity, he seems, for a brief stretch of the episode, genuinely happy. Not the performed version of happiness, something quieter and more real. Then it falls apart, the way things tend to fall apart for Rick, and Unity leaves. The episode ends with Rick in his garage lab, alone, placing a device under his chin that is clearly meant to end his life. He passes out drunk before it activates. The show cuts to the opening credits. There is no discussion of what just happened in the next episode. No character brings it up, no lesson is delivered. The show simply shows you the bottom of Rick Sanchez's life and then moves on, the same way Rick does. Because that is the point. Rick survives his worst moments not because he processes them, but because he outlasts them through sheer chemical unconsciousness, and then buries them with the rest of what he refuses to feel. He does not heal, he continues. This is a specific and recognizable pattern to anyone who has watched someone they love manage pain through avoidance. The genius is real. The confidence is real in its own way. But the whole structure of Rick's life, the adventures and the gadgets and the loudness and the drinking, is also a very elaborate way of never sitting still long enough to feel what is underneath. Bird Person understood it. Tiny Rick's drawings understood it. The show has been telling you from the first season that the most dangerous place in the universe for Rick Sanchez is not some alien prison or galactic tribunal. It is a quiet room with no distractions and nothing in his hand. What makes this theory about Rick so enduring among fans is that it does not require reading between lines that aren't there. The show put the lines there. It told you in the first season that his catchphrase was a cry for help. It showed you the suicide attempt in Season 2. It confirmed in Season 5 that the drinking started with grief so enormous most people would not have walked away from it at all. The theory is simply that these pieces are not separate character details. They form a complete picture of one specific kind of person. A person who survived something unsurvivable and then spent the rest of his life making sure he was too busy and too loud and too drunk to notice that surviving is not the same as being okay. Rick never gets better in any clean or final way. The show is honest about that. There are moments where something shifts, where he reaches toward the people he loves in ways that cost him something, where he chooses connection over isolation, even briefly, but they do not last. The default always reasserts itself, because that is also how this works in real life. The person who has spent decades not dealing with something does not deal with it because someone convinces them to. They circle it. They get close sometimes. They pull back. They keep moving. The flask is always in his hand. The catchphrase is always in his mouth. And underneath all of it, buried under decades of genius and cruelty and chemical numbness and noise, is a man who lost everything that mattered to him before the show even begins. A man who told you he was in great pain in the very first season. A man who has been asking for help the entire time in the only language he knows how to use, which is a language almost nobody ever understands until someone translates it for them in the middle of a garage party, and even then, the person it's about is too far away to hear it. That is Rick Sanchez. Not the smartest man in the universe performing a life. A person who built the performance because the alternative was sitting with what happened. And sitting with what happened was the one thing his intelligence could never solve. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That was the story of what lives underneath Rick's constant noise and motion. A grief so old and so heavy that he turned it into a personality. Coming up next, we go deeper into the question of whether the memories Rick has shared with the audience are even real, and what it means if the version of his past we have been watching was something he quietly rewrote for himself a long time ago. Section 2. The fabricated memory theory. Was Rick's whole backstory a lie he told himself? There is an episode in Season 3 of Rick and Morty that opens with Rick sitting in a Galactic Federation prison cell, completely calm, eating synthetic mashed potatoes and watching television. He has been captured. The Federation has sent an agent named Cornelius Daniel directly into Rick's mind to extract the secret of how Rick built his portal gun. And Rick, rather than fighting, rather than resisting, just smiles and says, "Sure, come on in. Let me show you you everything. What follows is a memory sequence. Rick walks the agent through his past, a younger version of himself in a garage lab, working quietly on a teleportation device. Another Rick appearing through a portal and offering him the secrets of interdimensional travel. The younger Rick, thinking it over, deciding the infinite multiverse life sounded lonely, choosing his family instead. Then a bomb coming through the portal. His wife Diane dying in the explosion. His daughter Beth dying beside her. The young Rick screaming on the ground, bleeding, as everything he loved turned to wreckage around him. The show plays that sequence with genuine emotional weight. The music slows down. The animation softens slightly. Rick's younger face, before all the cynicism settled in permanently, carries something open and unguarded that the present version of him has not worn in a very long time. Watching it for the first time, it feels like the show is finally giving you the thing you have been circling since the pilot, the real story of why Rick is the way he is, the wound at the center of everything. And then, a few minutes later, Rick reveals to Cornelius Daniel that the entire memory was fabricated. He constructed it specifically to distract the agent while he quietly took control of the situation from the inside. He never actually showed anyone the truth. He built a story, placed the agent inside it, and used the emotional architecture of that story as a weapon, while the real Rick was doing something else entirely underneath it. The episode, The Rick Shank Rickdemption, has Rick call the backstory totally fabricated. He says it plainly and without much ceremony, and that single line opened one of the longest running and most genuinely compelling theories in the entire Rick and Morty fan community. Because the question it raises is not a simple one. If Rick called the memory fabricated while he was actively deceiving a Galactic Federation intelligence agent, does that mean the backstory itself was false? Or does it mean Rick needed people to believe the backstory was false? Those are two entirely different things. The show spent 2 more full seasons making sure you could not easily tell them apart. The theory that developed in the community in the years after that episode goes something like this. Rick did not fabricate the backstory entirely. What he fabricated was the willingness to share it. The specific details in the memory, the wife, the daughter, the other Rick arriving through a portal, the bomb, were real. But Rick needed Cornelius Daniel, and through him the entire Galactic Federation, to believe they had been shown a lie. Because if the agent walked out of Rick's mind believing the emotional core of that memory was genuine, he would know something true and deeply dangerous about Rick Sanchez. He would know that Rick can be broken. He would know exactly where the wound is. So Rick called it fabricated not because it was, but because admitting it was real would have been the most exposed and vulnerable thing he had ever allowed himself to be in front of an enemy. And Rick does not do vulnerable in front of enemies. Rick barely does vulnerable in front of people he loves. This reading of the scene gained enormous weight when the season 5 finale Rick Mirai Jack arrived. In that episode, evil Morty captures Rick and extracts a full scan of his brain. This scan is not something Rick controls or curates. It is not a memory he chooses to show someone. It is a direct extraction of everything stored inside him, pulled out against his will by a version of his own grandson who has spent years planning exactly this moment. What comes out of that brain scan confirms the shape of the season 3 backstory almost entirely. There was a wife named Diane. There was a daughter named Beth. There was another Rick who came through a portal and offered him the secrets of interdimensional travel. And when Rick declined, that other Rick sent a bomb through to punish him for saying no. The emotional core that Rick called a total fabrication in season 3 turned out to be real after all. But the theory does not stop there, because Rick Mirai Jack also revealed something the season 3 version quietly left out. After Diane and Beth were killed, Rick did not immediately invent his portal gun and set off on a clean revenge quest the way the earlier version implied. What actually happened was slower and considerably darker. Rick was injured in the explosion. He was taken to a hospital. He spent time alone, grieving, before he eventually pulled himself back together and decided to finish the portal gun on his own terms. The season 3 version compressed that period almost entirely out of existence and moved straight from grief to action, which made Rick's response feel more heroic and purposeful than it actually was. The real version, confirmed later, was messier and more human. A man sitting alone in the wreckage of his life for an unknown stretch of time before he could figure out what to do next. That gap between the two versions is where the deeper layer of the theory lives. Because the question is not just whether the backstory was fabricated for Cornelius Daniel. The question is whether Rick has also been fabricating a cleaner version of it for himself. Whether the story he carries inside him about who he is and why he does what he does has been quietly edited over the decades into something more bearable. Trauma does that to people. Memory is not a recording device. It is a reconstruction process, and the reconstruction is always influenced by what the person needs to believe about themselves in order to keep going. Rick needed to believe he was a man of action who responded to tragedy with purpose tenuous and genius. The messy, grieving, hospitalized version of himself, sitting alone after the explosion, did not fit that story. So that part got compressed. The portal gun got invented, the quest began. The narrative moved forward with more momentum than the reality actually had. There is also a second layer to this fabrication theory that involves not just the past, but the present. Across the series, Rick's memories are shown to be unreliable in ways that go beyond simple dishonesty. In the episode Morty's Mind Blowers, it is revealed that Rick has been collecting and storing Morty's worst and most traumatic memories for years, editing them out of Morty's mind without his knowledge or consent. The stated reason is to protect Morty from memories too painful or damaging to carry. But the episode also reveals that some of Rick's own memories are in the collection. Memories that Rick apparently decided he also did not want to hold on to. The show does not dwell on this point, but it sits there quietly for anyone paying attention. Rick has been editing not just Morty's experience of their adventures together, but his own. Whatever version of events Rick is currently carrying, it has been through a filter. Things have been removed. The record is not complete. This connects to something the show returns to repeatedly across multiple seasons. Rick's relationship with the truth about himself is genuinely complicated. He is not simply a liar. He is something more specific than that. He is a person who understands himself very clearly on some level, who can diagnose his own patterns and name his own damage when he chooses to, but who also maintains a careful distance from full honesty about what those patterns have cost the people around him. The Pickle Rick therapy scene is the most famous example of this. The therapist in that episode does not tell Rick anything he does not already know. She tells him that he turns himself into a pickle to avoid therapy, because therapy requires him to be seen accurately by another person, and being seen accurately is something Rick cannot survive. Rick sits there and takes it. He has no comeback, because she is right, and he knows she is right. He knew before she said it. Knowing has never been the problem for Rick. The problem is what knowing would require him to do next. The fabricated memory theory, taken in full, suggests that Rick C-137 has been managing his own internal narrative the same way he manages everything else in his life, with intelligence and precision and a very deliberate hand on what gets shown and what gets buried. The Season 3 memory shown to Cornelius Daniel was fabricated in the sense that Rick chose to present it as fabricated. Whether the contents themselves were true was a separate question that the show answered slowly over the following 2 seasons. The answer was that the contents were largely real. The fabrication was the frame around them. The insistence that it was all a trick. The performance of having nothing real to hide. What Rick Mirai Jack confirmed, and what the deeper layers of this theory have always pointed toward, is that Rick's origin story is genuine and devastating, and has been shaping every single thing he does across the entire show. The wife was real. The daughter was real. The grief was real. The years of violence and revenge that followed were real. And somewhere inside all of that, Rick quietly adjusted the story he tells himself about it, made himself more decisive in the early days, removed the hospital, compressed the grief, kept the version where he responds to tragedy like a man in control of his own narrative, rather than the version where he sat alone for a long time not knowing what to do, which is the version that sounds the most like someone who actually lost something. The show never resolves this cleanly. It does not sit Rick down and have him admit that he has been managing the internal record. It does not need to. The evidence is distributed across the seasons carefully enough that the conclusion assembles itself if you follow the thread. Rick Sanchez is the smartest person in every room he enters. He can outthink governments and gods and alternate versions of himself, but he has also spent decades making sure the most honest version of his own history stays just far enough out of reach that he never has to stand in front of it completely. The fabricated memory was not just a trick played on a Federation agent. It was a glimpse at something Rick does constantly, quietly, and with the same precision he applies to everything else. The difference is that this is the one invention he built not to change the world around him, but to make the world inside him survivable. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That was the theory of the edited past. The idea that Rick has been quietly managing his own internal record for decades, keeping the most painful version of his history just far enough away to function. Next, we look at something even stranger. The question of whether the family Rick currently lives with is actually his family at all, and what it means that he moved in with them so quietly that nobody ever thought to ask. Section 3. C-137 is not who you think. The theory that our Rick replaced someone. There is a moment in Season 1 of Rick and Morty that the show treats almost like a footnote. It happens near the end of an episode called Rick Potion Number 9. Morty has asked Rick to make him a love potion so that a girl at school will like him. The potion goes wrong, then the fix goes wrong, then the fix for the fix goes wrong. By the end of the episode, the entire planet Earth has been transformed into grotesque mutated creatures that the show calls Cronenbergs, after the filmmaker whose body horror films inspired the visual. The world is irreparably broken. There is no undoing it. Every human being on the planet, except for the Smith family, has been turned into something unrecognizable. Rick sits quietly for a moment. Then he tells Morty to come with him. He opens a portal, they step through, and they arrive in another dimension. A dimension that is identical to the one they just destroyed, with one crucial difference. In this version of reality, Rick and Morty both died in a lab accident earlier that same day. The family is grieving. The house is the same. Beth and Jerry and Summer are all there, crying, dealing with the sudden loss of their Rick and their Morty. And the Rick and Morty from the Cronenberg universe simply walk in through the back door, bury the bodies of the versions of themselves who died, and take their places. No announcement, no explanation. Rick goes back to his garage. Morty goes back to his room. Life continues. Morty sits outside in the yard afterward and cries in a way that is genuinely difficult to watch for a show that is mostly about explosions and alien comedy. Because what just happened to him is not a joke. He watched his world end, helped bury a version of himself, and then moved into a dead stranger's life. Rick, for his part, seems almost entirely unbothered. He tells Morty the best thing to do with horrible outcomes is to not think about it. Then he goes inside. That scene is the foundation of one of the most quietly unsettling theories that has grown up around Rick and Morty over the years. Because what that scene establishes, plainly and without much comment, is that the Rick the audience follows is not the Rick this family started with. The Beth in the show is not Rick C-137's original daughter. The Summer and the Morty are not his original grandchildren. The house is not his house. He moved into it the same way someone moves into a furnished apartment. He took what was available because the alternative was nothing. The theory builds from there in several directions, and each direction leads somewhere more uncomfortable than the last. The first direction is about what this means for Rick's relationship with Morty, specifically. Throughout the show, Rick's bond with Morty is presented as one of the few genuine emotional anchors in his life. He chooses Morty for his adventures. He protects Morty at significant personal cost on several occasions. There are moments scattered across the seasons where Rick's care for Morty breaks through the performance of not caring and reads as completely real. The theory asks a straightforward question about all of that. Is Rick bonded to Morty, or is he bonded to the idea of Morty? Because this Morty, the one he travels with and argues with and occasionally risks everything for, is not the Morty he started with. His original Morty was Cronenberged along with everyone else. This one was a replacement, chosen not through love or history, but through availability and dimensional convenience. The show does not treat this as a settled question. In fact, it complicates it deliberately over time. Later seasons reveal that Rick C-137's original daughter Beth and original Morty were both killed long before the events of the show even begin, when Rick Prime bombed his house in Dimension C-137. The Rick and Morty who slide into the new dimension in Rick Potion number 9 are therefore already a pair who have been living in a replaced reality for some time. Rick lost his original family to Rick Prime's bomb. He spent decades hunting for revenge. Then he eventually settled into a new family's life, a Beth who survived because she belonged to a different dimension and never experienced the bomb at all. By the time the show begins, Rick has already been living with a family that is not originally his for an unspecified number of years. The Rick Potion number 9 slide simply adds another layer to that pattern. What the theory points to is that Rick has made a habit of this, not because he is cruel or indifferent to the specific people around him, but because the multiverse makes replacement so structurally easy that grief becomes optional. If you have a portal gun and access to infinite dimensions, you can always find a version of the life you lost. You can always find a Beth who survived. You can always find a Morty who needs a grandfather. You do not have to sit with the loss, because there is always another door to open. And Rick, who cannot sit with loss under any circumstances, who has built his entire psychological architecture around not feeling what he actually feels, finds the multiverse's infinite replaceability not horrifying, but genuinely useful. This is where the theory takes its darkest turn, because if replacement is always available, then attachment becomes structurally risky in a way it is not for ordinary people. An ordinary person who loses someone they love has no choice but to grieve, because there is only one version of that person, and when they are gone, they are gone. Rick does not have that problem. Rick has the opposite problem. Rick can always find another one, and knowing that he can always find another one means that every attachment he forms is shadowed by the awareness that it is provisional, that if this one ends, if this Beth disappoints him, or this Morty gets hurt, or this family falls apart, there is another dimension dimension where a slightly different version of all of them is living a slightly different version of the same life. Several moments across the show support this reading in ways that feel deliberate rather than accidental. In the episode Total Recall from Season 2, the family is invaded by parasitic aliens who implant false memories to make themselves seem like old friends. The way the episode works is that any character who only appears in happy memories is a parasite, because real relationships contain bad memories too. What that episode quietly establishes, underneath the comedy, is that Rick's relationship with this family is built on a foundation that includes the memory of burying the previous versions of themselves in a backyard. That is not a happy memory. That is an awful one, and it belongs only to Rick and Morty, held between the two of them, not shared with Beth or Jerry or Summer, who have no idea that the people they are living with slid in through a dimensional back door while they were grieving. There is also the question of what Rick's designation as C-137 actually means in this context. The show uses C-137 as Rick's identifier throughout, and the fan community has largely taken it to mean the dimension he originally came from. But the Rick and Morty wiki and the show's own canon, particularly after the Season 5 finale, complicate that reading significantly. Rick C-137 is named for the dimension he is from, but he has not lived in that dimension for most of his life. He left it after the bomb. He spent decades across the multiverse hunting Rick Prime. He settled into a replacement family in a replacement dimension, and the show began there, in a home that technically belonged to a Rick who died in a lab accident. The C-137 designation is less a current address than a scar. It is where he is from, not where he lives. It is the dimension where the worst thing happened. The theory also extends to what it means for the other characters, particularly Beth. The Beth in the show has a complicated relationship with Rick that the show explores carefully across its seasons. She resents his absence during her childhood. She craves his approval in ways she cannot always admit. She is deeply shaped by having a father who was brilliant and unreliable and ultimately chose to leave. The theory asks whether Rick experiences guilt about this Beth the same way he might experience guilt about his original daughter, given that this Beth's grief and abandonment were caused by a version of Rick who died in a lab accident, rather than by Rick C-137 himself. He inherited her damage without having caused it directly. He moved into a relationship defined by wounds he did not personally inflict, but that he also cannot honestly say are not his responsibility, because he chose to stay. He chose this family. He chose to let her call him dad. There is a version of Rick in which that choice reads as quietly heroic. He lost his original family. He found another one. He stayed. Whatever his reasons, whatever the complicated multiverse logic underneath it, he showed up and he remained, and he chose, over and over across the seasons, to stay with these people rather than keep moving to the next dimension. The theory does not require you to read that as nothing. It simply asks you to hold it alongside the knowledge that staying was always a choice, which means leaving was always an option, which means Rick's presence has never been unconditional in the way a parent's or grandparent's presence is supposed to be. He can always leave. He has left before. He left his original dimension and has not returned to live there since. What makes this theory so persistent in the fan community is that the show itself seems aware of it and keeps returning to the question without resolving it. In the Season 6 premiere Solarix, when a portal reset sends all travelers back to their dimensions of origin, Rick ends up back in C-137, the Cronenberged world he and Morty abandoned in Season 1. When he gets there, he discovers something that stops the episode cold. He had placed the entire dimension on a time loop. The day Morty and the previous Rick died and the world got Cronenberged had been repeating on an endless cycle for however long Rick had been gone. Time had not moved forward. The dimension had been frozen at its worst moment, over and over, while Rick went and built a new life somewhere else. The show presents this as something Rick eventually dismantles as part of trying to move forward. He lets the loop end. He allows the dimension to finally progress past the day everything broke. It is framed as a form of letting go, and on a surface level, it reads that way. But the deeper implication is more complicated. Rick had the ability to let that dimension move forward at any point over however many years had passed. He chose not to. He left it frozen. He kept the door open to the worst version of a world he had abandoned, preserving it in perpetual crisis, while he lived comfortably in a replacement family's home a dimension away. Whether that reads as grief or guilt or something stranger depends on how far you want to follow the theory, but the core of it holds across every layer of the show's canon. The Rick that audiences have been watching for every season of Rick and Morty is not the Rick this family originally had. He is a man who lost everything, found a reasonable substitute, and built something real inside it, while never quite closing the door on what came before. The family does not know this. Summer does not know. Jerry does not know. Beth suspects things, but does not know the full shape of it. Only Morty knows, and Morty has been carrying that knowledge since he sat in the backyard in Season 1 and cried next to a freshly covered grave that had his own name on it. That is the reality underneath the adventures and the comedy and the portal gun. The smartest man in the universe found a family by sliding quietly into one that had just lost theirs, and he never told them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That was the story of The Replacement, the quiet, dimensional sleight of hand that put Rick C-137 into a family that was never originally his, and what the show has been doing with that truth ever since. Coming up next, we look at the philosophy Rick performs constantly and loudly for anyone who will listen, and the theory that he has never actually believed a single word of it. Section 4. The Rick Sanchez Nihilism Theory. He doesn't believe a word of it. There is a speech Rick gives near the end of the Season 2 finale that a certain kind of viewer latches onto immediately and never lets go of. Rick has just surrendered himself to the Galactic Federation to save his family. He is being processed into a prison facility, and as he sits there, in handcuffs, being photographed and cataloged like any other criminal, he delivers a monologue that sounds like the definitive statement of his worldview. He talks about how nobody exists on purpose. Nobody belongs anywhere. The universe is chaos. Nothing means anything, and the best anyone can do is find something to watch on television before it all ends. The speech is delivered quietly and without the usual performance energy Rick brings to most of what he says. It lands differently because of that. It sounds, in that moment, less like a provocation and more like a confession. Like Rick is finally saying plainly what he has always believed underneath all the noise. Generations of fans have quoted it. It became one of the most circulated pieces of dialogue the show ever produced. And the argument it makes, that Rick Sanchez is at his core a genuine nihilist who truly believes existence is meaningless, became the dominant reading of his character for a significant portion of the audience. The theory examined in this section argues that reading is wrong. Not partially wrong or open to interpretation. Wrong in a way the show has been demonstrating consistently since the pilot, using Rick's own behavior as the evidence. Rick Sanchez does not believe nothing matters. The theory is that he desperately, almost frantically, needs nothing to matter, because the alternative is admitting that things do matter and have always mattered. And that admission would require him to confront everything he has spent decades running from. This is a meaningful distinction, and it is worth taking slowly. A person who genuinely believes nothing matters behaves a certain way. They are indifferent to outcomes. They do not form attachments. They do not feel the specific kind of pain that comes from caring about something and losing it. They move through the world with a particular kind of lightness that comes from having genuinely released the weight of consequences. Nihilism, as a lived philosophy rather than a dinner party position, produces a person who is calm in a specific way, unbothered in a specific way, present without being invested. Rick is not that person. Rick is one of the most invested characters in the entire show. He cares about outcomes constantly and demonstrably. He cares about Morty. He cares about Beth in the complicated, wounded way of someone who has guilt mixed into the love. He cares about his legacy. He cares about being right. He cares about being the smartest person in the room with an intensity that goes well beyond what a genuine nihilist would bother with, because a genuine nihilist would not need to be the smartest person in the room. Being the smartest person in the room only matters if rooms matter. Rick acts like rooms matter enormously. The show starts building the case against Rick's stated nihilism almost immediately. In the very first episode, Rick risks a significant amount to help Morty impress a girl at school. A true nihilist does not do this. A true nihilist hears that his grandson wants to impress someone and responds with complete indifference, because impressing people and being impressed by people is exactly the kind of meaning-making that nihilism rejects. Rick goes along. He helps. He grumbles about it and wraps the helping in a performance of reluctance and superiority, but he helps. The grumbling is the tell. A person who genuinely did not care would not need to perform not caring. You only perform indifference when indifference is not the thing you actually feel. This pattern repeats across the show with enough consistency to constitute a structural argument rather than a collection of isolated moments. Rick keeps doing things that only make sense if things matter to him. He builds elaborate revenge plots against people who have wronged Morty. He makes deals with cosmic entities to protect his family. He spends what the show implies are decades of his life hunting Rick Prime. Not because the multiverse requires it, not because some external authority demands it, but because because he cannot let it go. He cannot let it go because Diane and Beth mattered to him. If nothing mattered, they would not matter either. The revenge quest, which defines the deepest layer of Rick's entire character arc across the show, is the single most powerful piece of evidence against the nihilism he performs. You do not dedicate decades of your existence to avenging people whose loss left no mark on you. The hunt for Rick Prime is a monument to how much Rick cares, built entirely out of the wreckage of caring too much and losing everything anyway. The Season 3 episode that makes this most visible is not a dramatic one. It is not a season finale or a lore-heavy installment. It is Pickle Rick, which most people remember primarily as the episode where Rick turns himself into a vegetable to avoid family therapy and then fights his way through a building full of armed operatives using improvised rat-based armor. The action is genuinely impressive, and the comedy around it lands well, but the episode's real subject is introduced in the final scene, in the therapist's office, when Dr. Wong looks at Rick and explains what she sees. She tells him that he is the kind of person who invents extraordinary problems for himself to solve because solving extraordinary problems is safer than addressing ordinary ones. She tells him that his intelligence is not the source of his behavior, but the tool he uses to justify it. She tells him that turning himself into a pickle to avoid a therapy session is not a demonstration of not caring. It is a demonstration of caring so much about not being examined that he will go to spectacular lengths to prevent it. Rick sits there. He does not argue. He does not deploy a witty comeback. He does not dismiss her the way he dismisses almost every other authority figure in the show. He sits there and he takes it, and the silence is the most honest thing he does in the entire episode. A nihilist does not care about therapy enough to avoid it. Avoiding something requires that the something has power over you. Rick goes to extraordinary lengths to stay away from the therapist's office precisely because what happens in a therapist's office, being seen clearly by someone trained to see clearly, is the thing he fears most. The pickle transformation is not a prank. It is a panic response dressed up as a joke. Dr. Wong identifies this and says it directly. Rick's lack of rebuttal confirms it. The most precise single moment in the entire series for this theory, however, is in the Season 3 finale, the Rickchurian-Morty date. Rick has spent the episode in an escalating conflict with the President of the United States, which eventually expands into a full confrontation between Rick and the entire Smith family. The family tells Rick they do not need him. Rick, performing his philosophy fully, agrees. He says fine. He says he does not need them either. He activates his portal gun and steps through. He comes back. Not after a long absence that the show treats as meaningful. Not after some adventure that changes his perspective. He comes back almost immediately, within the same episode, because he cannot not come back. The show does not explain this in dialogue. Rick does not deliver a speech about why he returned. He simply returns because leaving was not actually something he could do, regardless of what he said before stepping through the portal. The family is sitting there. He needs them to be sitting there. He came back to make sure they were still sitting there. That moment is about 40 seconds of screen time. It contains no monologue. It resolves nothing in any dramatic sense. But as evidence against Rick's stated philosophy, it is close to definitive. The man who says nothing matters and nobody belongs anywhere came back to the specific people he belongs to within the same episode of declaring he did not belong to them. His own body refused to perform the philosophy his mouth endorses. The wider fan theory around Rick's nihilism has always pointed towards something that the show gradually confirms over its seasons. Rick's philosophy is not a conclusion he reached through genuine intellectual engagement with the nature of existence. It is a coping mechanism he developed after the worst thing that ever happened to him happened. When Diane and Beth were killed by Rick Prime, Rick was faced with a universe that had just demonstrated its capacity for random, catastrophic, meaningless destruction. The people he loved most were gone because another version of himself was offended that Rick wanted to stay home with his family. There is no framework in which that makes sense. There is no meaning available in that loss that does not also make the loss more painful to bear. Nihilism offered Rick an exit from that problem. If nothing means anything, then the loss of Diane and Beth does not mean anything either. If the universe is chaos without purpose, then what Rick Prime did was not a meaningful act of cruelty, but simply chaos expressing itself. If nobody belongs anywhere, then Rick's grief about belonging somewhere and having it destroyed is not grief, but just noise. The philosophy is not an intellectual position. It is an emotional anesthetic applied to a wound that has never properly closed. This is why Rick cannot actually live the philosophy he endorses, because living it would require letting go of the wound, and letting go of the wound would mean accepting that what happened did not matter. And accepting that what happened did not matter is the one thing Rick Sanchez Sanchez genuinely cannot do. Diane mattered. Beth mattered. The life he chose over the infinite multiverse adventure, the quiet domestic life that Rick Prime apparently found so offensive, mattered to him enormously. The nihilism is not what Rick believes. It is what Rick needs to pretend to believe so that the truth of how much things matter does not destroy him completely. The show earns this reading most fully in the later seasons, particularly across Season 5 and the episodes that deal with Rick Prime directly. When Rick finally confronts Rick Prime in Season 7, the revenge quest that has defined his entire existence comes to its conclusion. What the show does with that conclusion is careful and deliberate. Rick kills Rick Prime. The thing he has spent decades working toward happens. And what Rick experiences afterward is not relief. It is not peace. It is not the clean resolution that the nihilist who claims not to care about anything would theoretically feel upon completing a task and moving on. What Rick experiences is closer to emptiness. The purpose that the hunt gave him, the forward momentum of the revenge quest, is gone. And without it, he is left with exactly the thing he has been avoiding the whole time: himself, the grief, the love underneath the grief, the life he wanted and the people who were taken out of it, and all the decades of noise he has generated since to avoid sitting with what that actually cost him. Nihilism did not survive contact with Rick Prime's death, not because Rick suddenly became a different person or had a clean emotional breakthrough that rewrote his character, but because the performance had always been in service of something specific, and when that something specific ended, the performance had no more work to do. What was left underneath was not a man who believed nothing mattered. It was a man who had spent most of his life trying to convince himself of that, and failing quietly every single time. The bird person translation from Season 1 fits here again. Wubba lubba dub dub means I am in great pain, please help me. A nihilist has no great pain. Pain requires caring about the thing whose loss or absence or damage produced the pain. Rick's catchphrase, his most repeated and most performed piece of verbal nonsense, turns out to be a direct contradiction of everything he claims to believe. He is in great pain. That means something matters to him. That has always been the truth. The nihilism is the noise he makes to drown out the signal. The signal has been there since the beginning, waiting for anyone paying close enough attention to hear it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That was the case against Rick's nihilism. The argument that his stated philosophy has never been a genuine belief, but a very elaborate defense built on top of a very old wound. Coming up next, we look at what Rick's behavior across the multiverse may have created without him ever intending to, and the theory that the most dangerous villain in the show's history might be entirely Rick's own making. Section 5. The Evil Morty Connection Theory. What Rick really created. There is a character who appears briefly in Season 1 of Rick and Morty, says almost nothing, and then disappears for several seasons. When he comes back, the show treats his return as one of its biggest moments. By the time his full story is told across Seasons 5 and 7, he has become arguably the most compelling figure in the entire series. His name is Evil Morty. He wears an eye patch. He is calm in a way that no other character in the show manages to be calm. A stillness that reads less like peace and more like someone who has already thought through every possible outcome and made their decision long before anyone else arrived at the conversation. Most discussions of Evil Morty focus on what he does, the political maneuvering inside the Citadel of Ricks, the Omega device, the escape beyond the central finite curve. These are all genuinely interesting story beats, and the show handles them with more care than it handles most of its larger plot movements. But the theory examined in this section is not primarily about what Evil Morty does. It is about what created him. And the argument, supported carefully by what the show eventually confirmed in Season 7, is that Evil Morty is not an anomaly, or an accident, or a random villain who emerged from the chaos of the multiverse. He is the logical, and perhaps inevitable product of the way Rick Sanchez treats the Mortys around him. He is what happens when a Morty pays attention for long enough and draws the conclusions that the situation actually warrants. To understand why this theory carries the weight it does, it helps to start with what the show establishes about Mortys in general before Evil Morty's origin is revealed. Across the early seasons, the relationship between Ricks and their Mortys is shown to be deeply transactional and frequently abusive in ways the show mostly plays for dark comedy. Ricks keep Mortys because Morty's brainwaves, described as stupid and unsophisticated, cancel out Rick's genius brainwaves and make him harder for galactic authorities to detect. Morty is, in functional terms, a cloaking device, a piece of living equipment that Rick carries around because it makes his own movements safer. The emotional bond that develops on top of this utility is real, in Rick C-137's case at least, but the foundation foundation underneath the bond is instrumental. Morty started as a tool. The affection came later, unevenly, and has never fully displaced the original dynamic. The Citadel of Ricks, which is the society built by the multiverse's Ricks as a kind of interdimensional homeland, makes this dynamic institutional. The Citadel mass produces Mortys. It regulates them. It assigns them. The entire system is built around the understanding that Mortys exist to serve Ricks, that their function is defined by their usefulness to someone smarter and more powerful than themselves, and that the relationship is not one between equals, but between a person and a resource that happens to have feelings. The Citadel does not hide this. It does not even seem embarrassed by it. It is simply the architecture of how things work, presented as natural and self-evident. Evil Morty's origin story, when it finally arrives in Season 7's episode Unmortrican, does something that many fans found surprising after years of theories involving time travel and secret identities and elaborate tragic backstories. It turns out to be simple. Evil Morty was a regular Morty. He belonged to a regular Rick. His Rick took him on adventures. His Rick made him do dangerous things. His Rick treated him the way Ricks treat Mortys, which is to say, with a mixture of genuine occasional affection and consistent instrumental disregard. He was scared constantly. He was used consistently. He was never asked if any of this was something he wanted. And at some point, after enough of this had accumulated, he decided he was not going to do it anymore. The simplicity of that origin is the point. The show had spent years allowing fans to theorize that Evil Morty must be something exceptional. A time-displaced version of Morty Prime. A clone with altered memories. A Morty from a dimension where something uniquely terrible happened to create someone uniquely dangerous. What the show delivered instead was a Morty from whom nothing uniquely terrible happened beyond the standard experience of being a Morty. The implication, delivered quietly but without ambiguity, is that the standard experience of being a Morty is already terrible enough to produce this outcome. Evil Morty is not an exception to what the Rick and Morty relationship does to Mortys. He is an example of what it does. In the case of a Morty who was paying close enough attention to understand it fully. This is where the theory about Rick C-137's specific role in creating Evil Morty becomes most interesting. Because the Season 7 reveal does not implicate Rick C-137 as Evil Morty's Rick. Evil Morty belonged to a different Rick. Rick C-137 did not directly create Evil Morty. But the theory is not that Rick C-137 created Evil Morty personally. The theory is that Rick C-137 created the system and the culture that made Evil Morty possible, probable, and perhaps unavoidable. The Citadel of Ricks, with all of its institutional treatment of Mortys as resources rather than people, was built under Rick C-137's oversight. He oversaw its construction. He was the Rick who organized the other Ricks into a collective, who established the norms that the Citadel runs on, who set the terms of what a Rick and Morty relationship is supposed to look like at an institutional level. Evil Morty's Rick was operating within a system that Rick C-137 helped design. There is also the question of what Rick C-137's own treatment of Morty Prime communicates to the wider multiverse about how Mortys should be treated. Rick C-137 is, by the show's own accounting, the Rickest Rick, the most capable, the most independent, the most extreme version of himself across the central finite curve. What the Rickest Rick does with his Morty sets a kind of standard. And what the Rickest Rick does with his Morty includes dragging him into situations that traumatize him regularly, editing his memories without consent, using him as a human shield in the early episodes in ways the show later treats with more seriousness, and building an entire emotional dynamic that keeps Morty dependent and useful while Rick maintains the structural advantage of being the indispensable one. The Season 2 episode, Morty's Mind Blowers, is essential to this part of the theory. In that episode, Morty discovers a secret room in Rick's garage filled with vials of his own extracted memories. Rick has been removing Morty's worst memories for years, presenting the practice as a kindness, as something he does to protect Morty from experiences too damaging to carry. But as the episode unfolds, the picture becomes more complicated. Some of the memories Rick removed were not simply traumatic. Some of them were memories in which Rick was wrong, or cruel, or directly responsible for harm done to Morty. Rick did not just remove Morty's pain, he removed Morty's ability to hold Rick accountable for causing it. The memory removal is not purely protective, it is also self-serving. It ensures that Morty's picture of Rick stays cleaner than the reality warrants. A Morty who retained all of his memories, who had full access to the complete record of what his adventures with Rick have actually cost him, would have a very different relationship with Rick than the one the show depicts. He would have grounds for a grievance that went well beyond the ordinary frustrations of being dragged to dangerous planets and used as a distraction. He would would have the full accounting. Rick made sure he never got it. The memory removal is not just a violation of Morty's autonomy, though it is certainly that. It is also a maintenance strategy. It keeps the dynamic functional by ensuring Morty never accumulates enough clarity to challenge it fundamentally. Evil Morty's origin in Season 7 suggests that his Rick did not have such a thorough maintenance strategy, or that Evil Morty was paying attention in ways that made the strategy fail. The cold open of Un-Mortican shows what appears to be an ordinary argument between a Rick and a Morty that turns out to be Evil Morty and his original Rick. The argument is mundane. The Rick is dismissive in the ordinary way of Ricks. Evil Morty is quiet in a way that reads, in retrospect, as a Morty who has already made his decision. He is not angry in that moment. He is past anger. He has reached the conclusion that the situation requires a response, and he is in the process of implementing it. The calm is not detachment. It is clarity. What Evil Morty eventually does with that clarity, the political campaign inside the Citadel, the Omega device, the escape beyond the central finite curve, is a systematic dismantling of everything that keeps Mortys in their position. He does not try to reform the system from within. He does not petition the Ricks for better treatment or attempt to negotiate a different arrangement. He decides the entire structure is irredeemable and removes himself from it permanently, taking the exit that no other Morty had thought to look for or had the capability to reach. The central finite curve, the boundary that Rick C-137 built to ensure that every dimension within it was one where a Rick was the smartest being alive, is exactly what Evil Morty blows open on his way out. He does not just escape Rick, he escapes the entire architecture of a universe designed around Rick's supremacy. That detail matters enormously for the theory. The central finite curve is Rick C-137's creation. It is the most literal possible expression of Rick's need to be the most important presence in any room he occupies. He built a boundary around a section of the infinite multiverse specifically to ensure that within that boundary, intelligence of his particular variety would always sit at the top of the hierarchy. It is an act of cosmic insecurity performed at a scale most beings could not conceptualize. And it is the thing Evil Morty targets most directly. He does not go after any individual Rick. He goes after the structure that makes Rick's dominance permanent and inescapable. He goes after the thing Rick built to make sure the situation could never fundamentally change. There is a speech Evil Morty gives in the Season 5 finale, Rick Mirai Jack, that the fan community has dissected extensively and for good reason. He tells the assembled Ricks that he is no more evil than any Morty who grew tired of the cycle and decided to do something about it. He positions himself not as a villain who emerged from unique darkness, but as a representative of a logical response to a universal condition. Every Morty who has ever felt the weight of the dynamic, who has ever understood that their Rick sees them as useful first and a person second, is a potential Evil Morty. He is not the exception. He is the outcome that the system was always trending toward, delayed in most cases by the memory removal and the brainwave cloaking, and the adventure adrenaline, and the genuine moments of warmth that Rick provides in between the exploitation. The theory's most uncomfortable conclusion is that Rick C-137 knows this. Not necessarily about Evil Morty specifically, but about the dynamic in general. He is too intelligent not to understand what the Rick and Morty relationship looks like from Morty's side of it. He has seen enough, done enough, and removed enough of Morty's memories to be aware that the accumulation of those removed memories represents a grievance of significant size. There are moments in the show, quiet ones, where Rick's behavior toward Morty shifts in ways that suggest guilt rather than simply affection. He goes further than utility would require. He takes risks that only make sense if Morty matters to him in a way that goes beyond his usefulness as a brainwave camouflage. These moments are real, but they exist inside a structure that Rick himself built and has never fundamentally altered. Evil Morty did not come from nowhere. He came from the entirely predictable consequence of treating intelligent, feeling beings as instruments across thousands of dimensions for decades. He came from a system that Rick C-137 helped design, that Rick C-137 normalized through his own behavior with his own Morty, and that Rick C-137 protected from the outside with a cosmic boundary ensuring it could never be challenged from a position of genuine equality. The smartest man in every universe built something that eventually produced its own most sophisticated critic. And that critic's most devastating move was not to fight Rick, it was to leave, to find the door that the central finite curve was specifically designed to keep hidden and walk through it without looking back. Rick C-137 has never fully reckoned with what that means. The show has not required him to. But the theory holds the question open. happen. Every Morty who travels with a Rick, every memory that gets removed, every time a Rick tells a Morty that nothing matters while simultaneously needing that Morty desperately, is another step toward the same conclusion that evil Morty reached. The only thing preventing more of them from reaching it is that most Ricks are better at maintenance than evil Morty's Rick was. Rick C-137, for all his intelligence and all his genuine feeling for Morty Prime, is also very good at maintenance. The room full of extracted memory vials in his garage is the evidence. He has been managing the situation carefully for years. Evil Morty is what happens when the management fails. He is the truth of the dynamic, unfiltered and fully conscious of itself, walking out the door that was never supposed to exist. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That was the theory of what Rick built without meaning to. The system and the culture and the cosmic architecture that produced its own most dangerous consequence in the form of a Morty who simply paid attention. Coming up next, we leave the theories behind and move into something that happened in the real world. The charges, the fallout, and the night that the show's future became genuinely uncertain. Section 6. The charges that changed everything. Justin Roiland's arrest and what followed. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a creative industry when someone at the center of something beloved becomes the subject of a serious criminal allegation. It is not the silence of disbelief exactly, though that is part of it. It is more the silence of a large number of people simultaneously recalibrating. Fans recalibrating what the thing they loved means now. Colleagues recalibrating what they knew and when they knew it. Networks recalibrating what their continued association with a person costs them versus what severing that association costs them. Everyone recalibrating at once, and none of it happening out loud because nobody is quite sure yet what the right thing to say is. That silence fell over Rick and Morty in January of 2023, and the thing that caused it had actually begun more than 2 years earlier, in a completely different news cycle, in a moment that most people outside a small circle of legal and industry insiders did not notice at all. Justin Roiland, the co-creator of Rick and Morty and the voice of both its titular characters across all 6 seasons that had aired at that point, was arrested in 2020. The charges were felony domestic battery and felony false imprisonment. They stemmed from an incident involving a woman he had been in a relationship with. The details of what was alleged were serious. Domestic battery under California law, at the felony level, involves inflicting corporal injury resulting in a traumatic condition on an intimate partner. False imprisonment, also at the felony level, involves restraining, confining, or detaining someone without their consent through violence, menace, fraud, or deceit. These were not minor charges. These were not the kind of allegations that get filed casually or resolved quickly. For reasons that are not fully clear from public record, the arrest did not become widely known in 2020. It happened, it was processed through the legal system in the way that felony charges are processed, but it did not land in the public conversation. The entertainment press did not pick it up, fans did not know. Adult Swim did not publicly address it. Rick and Morty Season 5 aired in 2021, with Roiland voicing both characters as he always had. Season 6 aired in 2022, again with Roiland in his full role. The production of the show continued around a legal situation that the people running the show were presumably aware of at some level, while the audience watched and rated and discussed and had no idea that anything was wrong. Then, in January 2023, the situation became public. A report surfaced detailing the charges, the timeline, and the fact that the case had been making its way through the California court system for over 2 years without resolution. The report named Roiland specifically and included information about the nature of the allegations with enough detail to make clear this was not a misunderstanding or a minor dispute blown out of proportion by a legal technicality. The entertainment press picked it up immediately. It spread across social media within hours, and the recalibration began. The response from Adult Swim in the immediate days following the January 2023 report was notably quiet. The network did not issue an immediate statement cutting ties. It did not announce a hiatus or a production pause. It did not say much of anything publicly, which, in the context of a major studio dealing with a serious allegation against one of its most prominent creators, is itself a kind of statement. Studios that are confident about their position tend to speak. Studios that are assessing the situation carefully tend to wait. Adult Swim waited. What happened during that waiting period is not fully documented in public record, but the outcome of it became clear in April 2023. Adult Swim officially announced that it had severed its professional relationship with Justin Roiland. The announcement was brief and did not include extensive commentary. Roiland was out. The show would continue. The characters of Rick Sanchez and Morty Smith, both of which Roiland had voiced since the very first episode in 2013, would be recast. The voice that that had defined the show for a decade. The particular quality of Roiland's performance that gave both characters their rhythm and their strangeness and their specific emotional texture would be replaced by someone new. Around the same time, Disney's 20th television animation, which had worked with Roiland on the animated series Solar Opposites and Koala Man, also cut ties with him. Roiland resigned from Squanch Games, the virtual reality game studio he had founded. The professional infrastructure of his career collapsed across multiple fronts within a relatively short window. He had been one of the more prominent figures in adult animation, with projects across multiple platforms and a public profile that extended well beyond any single show. By the middle of 2023, essentially all of it was gone. The charges themselves were eventually dismissed. In March 2023, the district attorney's office dropped the case against Roiland due to insufficient evidence. The alleged victim in the case did not cooperate with prosecutors, which in domestic violence cases is not uncommon and does not, in legal or moral terms, settle the question of what happened. Insufficient evidence for a criminal conviction is a specific legal standard. It means the prosecution determined it could not prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt in front of a jury. It does not mean the allegations were false. It does not mean nothing happened. It means the evidentiary threshold for a criminal conviction was not met, which is a narrower determination than it is sometimes presented as being in public discussions. Adult Swim did not reverse its decision after the charges were dismissed. Neither did 20th Television Animation. The professional separations that had been announced held. This detail matters because it indicates that the organizations involved were not simply responding to the existence of criminal charges in a reflexive way that would naturally reverse when the charges did not result in a conviction. They had made an assessment that went beyond the specific legal outcome and decided the separation was warranted regardless of how the court case resolved. For the cast and crew of Rick and Morty, the period between January and April 2023 was described later by those who discussed it publicly as genuinely difficult. Chris Parnell, who voices Jerry Smith and has been with the show since the beginning, spoke about it in subsequent interviews. He described a cast and production Zoom meeting during that period where people gathered to talk about what was happening and what it might mean for the show. He described the atmosphere as demoralizing. He described the uncertainty as real and significant. Nobody knew in those months whether Rick and Morty would survive the situation. The show had been built around Roiland's voice in a very literal sense. Both of its lead characters, the two figures whose names are in the title, the two figures who appear in every episode, were his performances. Replacing them was not a small logistical adjustment. It was a fundamental alteration of something that had been consistent for 10 years. Dan Harmon, the show's co-creator and the person most responsible for its narrative and structural direction, was notably restrained in his public commentary during this period. He did not make extensive statements about Roiland. He did not give lengthy interviews about the situation. He continued working on the show. The restraint was probably appropriate given the legal complexity of the situation and the professional relationships involved, but it also meant that the public voice most associated with Rick and Morty's creative direction was largely absent from the conversation, at a moment when the audience had a great many questions. The question of what the cast and crew knew and when they knew it is one that has never been answered fully in public. The arrest happened in 2020. The show produced and aired 2 full seasons between that arrest and the public disclosure in January 2023. People who work closely together in a writer's room and production environment tend to be aware of significant events in each other's lives. Whether anyone at Adult Swim or in the production knew about the charges during those 2 seasons and what decisions were made in light of that knowledge is something the public record does not address clearly. What is clear is that the production continued and the audience was not informed. This aspect of the situation is worth sitting with for a moment because it touches on something that goes beyond Justin Roiland specifically. The entertainment industry has a long and well-documented history of managing information about the private conduct of valuable talent in ways that prioritize the continuation of the valuable thing over the disclosure of the difficult thing. This is not a Rick and Morty specific phenomenon. It is a structural feature of how entertainment production has historically operated. The valuable person stays valuable as long as the difficult thing stays contained. When the difficult thing escapes containment, the recalibration begins. The January 2023 report was the moment of escape, and what followed was the recalibration happening in real time, in public, faster and more visibly than the industry usually allows these things to happen. For fans, the disclosure landed differently depending on how they chose to process it. Some fans separated the work from the person, arguing that the show itself was not implicated by the conduct of one of its creators, and that the characters of Rick and Morty existed independently of the man who originally originally voiced them. Some fans found the separation impossible to make cleanly, particularly given how central Roiland's voice and performance were to the specific identity of the show. Some fans responded with immediate and unqualified condemnation. Some responded with skepticism about the charges, given that they were eventually dismissed. The fan community, which had already demonstrated a capacity for strong and sometimes destructive collective responses, processed the situation with all the noise and contradiction that tends to accompany large groups of people confronting something they were not prepared for. What was not really in dispute, regardless of how individual fans felt about Roiland personally, was that Rick and Morty as a production faced a challenge unlike anything it had encountered in its 10 years of existence. The show had survived long gaps between seasons. It had survived the departure of writers. It had navigated the complicated dynamics of its own fan base through multiple controversies, but it had never faced the removal of the person who gave both of its central characters their voice. The recasting was not a creative choice made in pursuit of something new. It was a necessity imposed by circumstances that nobody in the production had chosen and nobody in the audience had anticipated. The show was renewed for additional seasons. Production continued. The decision was made to recast rather than retire the characters, which was itself a significant choice, reflecting a belief that Rick and Morty could survive the loss of its founding voice if the replacement was handled carefully. Whether that belief proved correct is a question the subsequent seasons addressed in complicated ways that the final sections of this essay will examine in detail. But in April 2023, when the announcement came, the primary feeling among the people who made the show and the people who watched it was not relief that the decision had been made. It was grief, mixed with anger, mixed with uncertainty about what exactly had been lost and whether what came next would be able to carry the same weight. Justin Roiland had been Rick Sanchez for 10 years. He had been Morty Smith for 10 years. He had been the voice in the room, the specific human performance that turned animated drawings into characters that millions of people felt genuinely attached to. His departure did not just change who was speaking the lines, it changed the texture of the entire enterprise. The show that came back was the same show in almost every structural sense. Same writers, same supporting cast, same animation style, same narrative continuity. But something in the room was different. Something in the voice was different, and the audience noticed, loudly and at length, in ways that created the next layer of controversy that Rick and Morty would have to navigate. The charges changed everything, not because they resulted in a conviction, because they did not. They changed everything because they forced a reckoning with the gap between what a show presents to the world and what is happening in the lives of the people who make it. Rick and Morty had always been a show about a character who performed a version of himself that was not entirely honest. Underneath the performance was pain. Underneath the confidence was damage. The show had been saying that about Rick Sanchez from the beginning. In January 2023, something similar became true of the show itself. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That was the story of the arrest, the disclosure, and the severance that followed, the night the professional world around Rick and Morty recalibrated in real time, and the show's future became genuinely uncertain. Coming up next, the charges were only the beginning, because what emerged across the rest of 2023 was a wider and more troubling picture of behavior that went well beyond a single incident. Section 7. The texts, the allegations, and the young fans. The wider misconduct story. When the domestic battery charges against Justin Roiland became public in January 2023, the initial response from a portion of the audience was to wait, to see how the legal process resolved, to reserve judgment on the basis that charges are not convictions, and that the American legal system operates on a presumption of innocence that exists for reasons worth respecting. This is a reasonable position to hold when a criminal allegation surfaces against a public figure. It is the position that many people who had followed Rick and Morty for years found themselves in during those early weeks of 2023, uncomfortable with what had been reported, but unwilling to reach a definitive conclusion while the legal picture remained unclear. Then the charges were dismissed in March 2023, and for that portion of the audience, the dismissal felt like confirmation of what they had been waiting to hear. The legal system had looked at the evidence and decided there was not enough to proceed. Whatever had happened, the argument went, it had not risen to the level of criminal culpability that a court could establish. People moved on. Adult Swim had already made its decision, and that decision was not reversed. But among fans, the sense was that the worst of the situation had passed. The show would continue with new voices. The legal chapter was closed. What nobody in that portion of the audience had fully reckoned with was that the legal chapter and the full picture of Justin Roiland's conduct were not the same document. The criminal charges addressed one specific incident from 2020. They said nothing nothing about a pattern of behavior that stretched across nearly a decade, involved multiple people, and had been documented in ways that went beyond a single complainant's account to prosecutors. That documentation began to surface publicly in September 2023, and what it contained was considerably more extensive and considerably more troubling than the domestic battery case had been. NBC News published a report in September 2023 that drew on interviews with multiple women and included documentation of communications between Roiland and young fans of his work. The report was specific and detailed in ways that made it difficult to dismiss as vague allegation or coordinated character attack. It named a time frame. It described a pattern. It included evidence of direct communication, and it placed that pattern in the context of Roiland's public profile as the creator of one of the most popular animated shows of its generation, a profile that gave him access to a large and devoted fan base that skewed young and that regarded him with the particular intensity reserved for creators whose work has shaped how people see themselves and the world. The time frame the NBC News report identified was broad, between 2013 and 2022, a period that encompasses almost the entire run of Rick and Morty. To that point, Roiland had allegedly pursued contact with young fans of his work. The fans in question included people who were minors at the time of the contact. The communications involved dating apps and social media platforms. The report described multiple women giving accounts of their experiences, accounts that shared structural similarities in ways that suggested a pattern rather than a series of unrelated incidents. One of the accounts that received significant attention involved a woman who had first come to Roiland's notice in 2019 when she was 19 years old. She had posted artwork inspired by Rick and Morty on social media. Roiland had responded to it publicly, drawing attention to her work and initiating contact. What followed, according to her account, was an invitation to visit him in Los Angeles. She went. She described an experience involving alcohol and a situation in which she felt she had been taken advantage of while severely intoxicated. She described the experience as traumatic. She described feeling used. Her account was specific about the circumstances and the aftermath. Another account involved a woman who had arranged to meet Roiland in Boston in March 2019 during a gaming convention. They had matched on a dating app. She was 20 years old at the time. What she described afterward was not a consensual encounter that she later reconsidered. She described a specific act that she had declined and that occurred anyway. She described being frightened. She described the difficulty of processing what had happened in the context of meeting someone she had admired through his creative work, someone who existed in her mind as the voice of characters she had grown up watching. This last detail is worth pausing on because it adds a dimension to the situation that is specific to creators of beloved fiction in a way that is not true of most other forms of public prominence. A politician or a business executive or a sports figure has a public profile, but that profile is attached to their public role. The attachment fans form to them is relatively transactional. They admire the performance or the achievement. With creators of fiction, and particularly with creators of animated shows that people encounter during formative years, the attachment is considerably more intimate. People do not just admire what the creator made. They feel that the creator made something that understood them, that spoke to something private in their experience. The characters feel like friends. The creator feels, by extension, like someone who knows them in a way most people do not. Roiland was not just famous. He was the voice of Rick Sanchez and Morty Smith. He was the voice of characters that a generation of young people had watched navigate anxiety and alienation and the difficulty of existing in a world that seemed indifferent to individual suffering. He was the voice of a show that many of its most devoted fans had first encountered in their teens, during exactly the period of life when fictional characters tend to carry the most emotional weight. When he made contact with young fans through social media and dating apps, he was not approaching them as a stranger. He was approaching them as someone they already felt they knew through thousands of hours of watching something he had made. That asymmetry is not incidental to the accounts these women gave. It is central to how the situations they described were able to develop the way they did. The report also surfaced material that predated the NBC News investigation. Earlier in 2023, screenshots had been shared online of text messages that Roiland had allegedly sent to a 16-year-old. The content of those messages was deeply inappropriate. The messages included language that no adult should direct at a minor under any circumstances. Roiland, or whoever sent the messages, appeared to be aware of the recipient's age. The framing of some of the language as joking did not resolve the problem of what was being joked about or to whom. The screenshots were widely shared and widely condemned when they surfaced, adding a specific and disturbing element to the picture that the September NBC News report would later place in a broader context of alleged behavior behavior involving young people. The question of when various institutions knew about these communications is one that the public record does not answer fully. Adult Swim had already severed ties with Roiland before the NBC News report published, on the basis of the domestic battery charges. Whether anyone at the network had awareness of the broader pattern of alleged behavior before the September report is not established in any document available to the public. What is established is that the September report changed the conversation significantly, even among people who had been willing to extend benefit of the doubt after the criminal charges were dismissed. The criminal charges were a legal matter that the legal system had resolved in a specific way. The pattern described by the NBC News report was a different kind of account, drawing on multiple sources across a longer timeline, and it did not resolve in the same way. It simply existed. It sat in the public record as a detailed description of how a powerful and beloved creator had allegedly used his access to young fans across nearly a decade. Roiland did not respond to the NBC News report with anything that functioned as a substantive denial of the specific allegations it contained. His representatives issued general statements. The allegations were described as false. There was no detailed engagement with the specific accounts or the documentation the report included. The absence of a detailed rebuttal did not prove the allegations were accurate, but it also did not provide an alternative account that could be weighed against what the women interviewed had described. The fan community's response to the September report was notably different in tone from its response to the January domestic battery disclosure. In January, a significant portion of the audience had maintained a wait-and-see position, on the grounds that the legal situation was unresolved. By September, the accumulation of what had been reported across the year made the wait-and-see position considerably harder to sustain. The sheer breadth of what the NBC News report described, the number of people involved, the time frame, the documentation, the specific details that multiple accounts shared in common, produced a different kind of reckoning than a single criminal charge had done. There is something specific that happens in fan bases when a creator's conduct is placed in sustained and documented conflict with the emotional content of the work they made. Rick and Morty, as a show, had always been in part about vulnerability and the difficulty of admitting need, and the damage done when powerful people treat those around them as instruments rather than as people with their own interior lives. These themes run through the character of Rick Sanchez in ways that the earlier sections of this essay have examined at length. The show had been celebrated for the sincerity of those themes. It had been credited with helping a generation of young people feel seen and understood. The gap between what the show said about power and vulnerability and what the September report described about how its creator had allegedly behaved with vulnerable young people was not a gap that was easy to close with any argument about separating art from artist. That argument, separating the art from the artist, is one that gets deployed frequently in these situations and carries real philosophical weight under certain circumstances. When an artist is long dead and their personal conduct is a matter of historical record rather than ongoing harm, the separation has a different texture than when the artist is alive and the conduct being described occurred recently and involved people who are still living with the consequences of it. The accounts in the NBC News report were not historical. They described situations from 2019 and beyond. The people involved were not figures from a distant past. They were women who had been in their late teens and early 20s when the alleged encounters occurred, who had come to Roiland through his work, and whose accounts described experiences that had been genuinely harmful. The show continued. Production on Season 7 was already underway with the new voice cast. The institutional decisions had been made. Adult Swim had moved forward. The writers were still writing, the animation was still being produced, but the context in which all of that work existed had changed in ways that were not easily undone by the quality of what was being made. Rick and Morty Season 7 would arrive carrying a weight that had nothing to do with its own content, a weight made up of everything that had been reported across 2023, everything that had been alleged, everything that had surfaced from a decade of a creator's conduct toward the young people who had loved what he made. The show that Justin Roiland built was about a man who performed a version of himself that was not honest. Underneath the performance was damage and grief and a pattern of behavior that hurt the people around him. The people closest to Rick kept finding this out in ways they had not been prepared for. The audience of Rick and Morty spent 2023 finding out something structurally similar about the man who had given that character his voice. The parallel is not a comfortable one to sit with, but it is the one that the year produced, clearly and in detail, across multiple reports and multiple accounts from multiple people whose experiences deserve to be heard on their own terms, rather than filtered through the question of what their accounts meant for a television show. What it meant for the television show was the subject of the seasons that followed. What it meant for the people in those accounts was a separate question entirely, and one that no amount of subsequent recasting or creative reinvention station could address on their behalf. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That was the full shape of what 2023 revealed about Justin Roiland, the domestic charges that started it, the wider allegations that followed, and the gap between what the show said about power and vulnerability and what the year's reporting described. Coming up next, we go back a few years to a moment that was very different in nature, but equally revealing about the specific intensity of this show's audience. The day Rick and Morty fans shut down a fast food chain across multiple American cities. Section 8, The Sauce Riots. The day Rick and Morty fans shut down McDonald's. There is a version of this story that is very funny. A cartoon scientist becomes obsessed with a discontinued dipping sauce from a fast food chain that nobody had thought about in nearly 20 years. The show's fan base takes the joke seriously and campaigns for the sauce to come back. The fast food chain, sensing a marketing opportunity, agrees to bring it back for one day. The day arrives. There is not enough sauce. People lose their minds. Police are called. A man trades his car for a single packet. The whole thing collapses into chaos that gets covered by national news outlets as though it were a genuine civic emergency. That version of the story is accurate. Every detail in it happened. And it is genuinely funny in the way that a lot of things involving large groups of people behaving badly over something objectively trivial tend to be funny when viewed from a sufficient distance. The image of someone standing outside a McDonald's in 2017 chanting the words Szechuan sauce with the same energy usually reserved for political protest is an image that captures something specific and absurd about the cultural moment it belongs to. But there is another version of this story sitting underneath the funny one, a version that is less comfortable and more revealing, a version about what happens when a show's relationship with its own audience crosses a threshold from enthusiasm into something that the creators of the show themselves described as frightening. That version is also accurate, and understanding both versions together is the only way to understand what the Szechuan sauce incident actually was, beyond the headlines and the memes it generated in the weeks that followed. The story begins with a decision that Adult Swim made in April 2017. The network released the season 3 premiere of Rick and Morty as a surprise, with no prior announcement on April Fool's Day. The episode, titled The Rick Shank Rickdemption, dropped without warning and without promotion, and the audience found it the way audiences find things in the social media era, which is to say, all at once and very loudly. The episode was the one examined earlier in this essay, the season 3 premiere, in which Rick escapes from Galactic Federation prison by manipulating an agent's journey through his memories. It was also the episode in which Rick, during a detour inside his own fabricated recollection, stops at a McDonald's and becomes fixated on a dipping sauce that the chain had sold briefly in 1998 as a promotional tie-in for the Disney animated film Mulan. The sauce was called Szechuan sauce. It was a sweet, plum-based dipping sauce that McDonald's had produced specifically for the Mulan promotion and then discontinued when the promotion ended. By 2017, it had been gone for 19 years. Most people who had tried it in 1998 had not thought about it since. It was not a beloved, lost product in any meaningful cultural sense. It was a forgotten footnote in the history of fast food condiments. Rick's obsession with it in the episode was played as a joke about Rick's capacity for fixating on absurd things, and also as a kind of gag about the nature of nostalgia and the strange specificity of the things people attach meaning to. Rick declares at the end of the episode that finding the Szechuan sauce is his series art, that if it takes 9 seasons, he wants that McNugget Szechuan sauce. It was a throwaway bit, an absurdist button on an episode that was primarily about other things. The writers of the show did not sit in a room and plan what was going to happen next. They made a joke about a discontinued condiment and moved on. The audience did not move on. Within days of the episode airing, a fan petition had been started on change.org calling for McDonald's to bring back the Szechuan sauce. The petition gathered tens of thousands of signatures with a speed that reflected both the size of the Rick and Morty fan base and its particular intensity. McDonald's corporate chef Mike Harax noticed the petition and the social media conversation around it. He posted on Twitter that he would see what he could do. This response, which was probably intended as a lighthearted acknowledgement of a funny internet moment, was received by the fan community as a genuine commitment. The expectation began building. Through the summer of 2017, McDonald's and the Rick and Morty fan base existed in a state of mutual awareness that the fast food chain was not fully equipped to navigate. The fan base wanted the sauce back. McDonald's was considering how to capitalize on the attention. Adult Swim and the show's creators were watching from a slight distance, aware that something was building, but not in control of it. Justin Roiland would later say that he had been aware for some time that the show's fan base had a capacity for intensity that made him nervous. The Szechuan situation was about to demonstrate exactly what he meant. In early October 2017, McDonald's announced that it would bring back the Szechuan sauce for one day only on October 7th as part of a promotion tied to the chain's new buttermilk crispy tenders. The sauce would be available at select locations in limited quantities. The announcement came with promotional artwork and social media excitement, and the general energy of a brand that believed it had found a clean and simple way to connect with a young, enthusiastic audience by giving them something they had publicly and loudly asked for. The problems with this plan were structural and significant, and they were apparent to anyone who thought carefully about the gap between the scale of demand the Rick and Morty fan base was capable of generating and the scale of supply that a limited one-day promotion at select locations could provide. The Rick and Morty fan base in 2017 was not a small or casual group. The show had become one of the most watched things on Adult Swim in the network's history. Its audience was young, internet native, and accustomed to mobilizing collectively around things it cared about. The announcement of the sauce's return did not reach a manageable number of interested people. It reached millions of them simultaneously and activated a significant portion of them into genuine action. On October 7th, fans arrived at McDonald's locations across the United States in numbers that bore no relationship to what McDonald's had prepared for. In Los Angeles, hundreds of fans lined up around the block at a location on La Brea Avenue. Some of them had been there since the night before, camping out to secure a position near the front. They were wearing Rick and Morty merchandise. Some of them were in costume. The energy in the line was the particular energy of a crowd that has convinced itself that what it is waiting for matters enormously. An energy that is sustainable as long as the wait has a positive resolution, and becomes very quickly unsustainable when it does not. The resolution was not positive. Reports from multiple locations across the country indicated that individual stores had received as few as 20 packets of the sauce. 20 packets for a line of hundreds of people that stretched around the block. Some locations had received no sauce at all. When the announcements came that the sauce had run out or had never arrived, the response from the crowds was not the grumbling disappointment of people who had hoped for something and been let down. It was rage. Loud, physical, sustained rage that shocked McDonald's employees and quickly drew the attention of law enforcement. In Los Angeles, the crowd at the La Brea location became physically disruptive. People shoved at the entrance. Altercations broke out. The LAPD was called to manage the situation. Videos captured fans chanting, some sarcastically and some with what appeared to be genuine fury, while store employees who had no power over the supply situation tried to manage a crowd that was in no mood to be managed. The scene was broadcast on social media in real time, which meant that the anger and the chaos spread beyond the physical locations and amplified the online response, which in turn fed back into the mood at the actual sites. Florida and the Bay Area reported similar scenes. Fights broke out, store staff were verbally abused with a persistence and viciousness that went far beyond what anyone waiting for a condiment had any reasonable basis for directing at a person who came to work that day to make minimum wage and serve food. The Daily Dot reported that across the country, videos showed lines of outraged fans in disbelief and disgust. Medium reported that fights broke out, staff were verbally abused, riots erupted, and police arrived at multiple locations. The word riots was not hyperbole chosen for effect. It reflected what the footage showed. In the days following October 7th, one detail circulated widely enough to become symbolic of the entire event. A fan had traded his car for a single packet of Szechuan sauce. Not a large supply of it, not a case of it, a single small packet, the same size and shape as any other fast food condiment packet, containing a few tablespoons of a plum-based dipping sauce that had originally been a promotional item for an animated film about Chinese folklore. Someone had given up their car for this. The car trade was real. It was documented. It was covered by news outlets as though it required explanation, though the explanation it actually required was less about the sauce and more about what the sauce had come to represent in the specific emotional economy of a fan base that had attached enormous significance to something that was, objectively, a condiment. Justin Roiland responded publicly in the immediate aftermath. He posted on Twitter that he was not happy with how McDonald's had handled the situation and that the whole event had nothing to do with Adult Swim or anyone officially connected to Rick and Morty. He asked fans to be cool to the employees and noted that the employees were not responsible for what had happened. The statement was sincere in its concern for the workers who had been treated badly, and it was notable for the care it took to separate the show's official connection from the chaos that had erupted in its name. Dan Harmon and Roiland both moved quickly to distance themselves from the fan behavior without condemning the fans entirely, a careful navigation of the situation that reflected awareness of how combustible the fan base could be when it felt criticized. McDonald's issued an apology and a promise. The company acknowledged that it had not anticipated the overnight crowds, the cross-state travel, and the intensity of demand. It promised more sauce and more locations in the future. In February 2018, McDonald's followed through, distributing 20 million packets of Szechuan sauce across every location in the United States in an attempt to finally satisfy the demand that the October promotion had so catastrophically underestimated. One fan had traded a car for a packet that February's distribution would make freely available nationwide. The mathematics of that exchange, between the October packet and the February packets, was a fairly precise illustration of what happens when a fan base's collective mania runs ahead of basic supply and demand reality. The Szechuan sauce incident did not exist in isolation. It belonged to a broader pattern of Rick and Morty fan behavior that had been building for several years before October 2017 and would continue afterward. The show had attracted, alongside its large and largely thoughtful general audience, a vocal and sometimes aggressive subset of fans who had developed a possessive and intense relationship with the show and its creators that went beyond normal enthusiasm. These were fans who felt entitled to the show in a specific way, entitled to its continuation, entitled to its content, entitled to the creator's time and attention and availability, and who responded to perceived failures of that entitlement with genuine anger. This subset had been making its presence felt in various ways before the sauce incident. Roiland and Harmon had faced sustained harassment on social media from fans demanding to know when Season 3 was coming during the long gap between Seasons 2 and 3. The harassment had not been gentle or patient. It had been the kind of relentless, aggressive pressure that accumulates across months of repeated contact from thousands of people and takes a toll even on people who are professionally accustomed to public attention. Roiland had spoken about this and about the anxiety it produced before the sauce incident happened. The sauce incident was therefore not a revelation of something new about the fan base. It was a very visible and very public expression of something that had been present for years, given a specific, intangible focus by a promotional event that was never equipped to contain the energy it released. What the incident also revealed, in ways that became more significant in subsequent years, was the difficulty of a show's creators managing the culture that grows up around their work. Rick and Morty had not made its audience behave the way it behaved outside McDonald's on October 7th. The show did not instruct anyone to drive across state lines for a condiment, or trade a car for a packet, or abuse a minimum wage employee who ran out of sauce. But the show had cultivated a certain kind of intensity in its most devoted followers, had encouraged the feeling that engagement with the show was a mark of intelligence and taste and belonging, and had perhaps underestimated how that feeling could curdle under the right circumstances into something that looked less like fandom and more like collective mania with nowhere appropriate to direct itself. Dan Harmon said after the incident that if you make a show that really good people like, some bad people are going to like it too. The quote was about something else originally, about a different dimension of the fan base's behavior that the next section of this essay will address directly, but it applies here as well. The sauce riots were not caused by bad people in any simple sense. They were caused by a very large group of people who had assigned enormous meaning to something small, who had been told by a promotional event that the small thing was available and then discovered it was not, and who responded to that disappointment with the kind of anger that only makes sense if the stakes felt much higher than a condiment. The stakes felt higher because for this particular group of people, the sauce had stopped being a sauce some time before October 7th. It had become a symbol of belonging, a piece of the show made tangible, a thing that connected them physically to something they loved at a level of intensity that the fast food industry was not remotely prepared to serve. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That was the day the sauce ran out, and something stranger than hunger took over. The story of how a throwaway joke about a forgotten condiment became a window into the specific and sometimes frightening intensity of Rick and Morty's most devoted audience. Coming up next, that intensity turned inward, and the targets were not a fast food chain, but the women who had been hired to write the show. Section 9, The Writer's Room War, when the fandom turned on the women who made the show. There is a particular irony sitting at the center of this story that becomes more visible the longer you look at it. Season 3 of Rick and Morty is widely regarded, including by the show's own creators, as one of its strongest seasons. The critical reception was the best the show had received at that point. The episodes were tighter, more emotionally precise, and more willing to sit with the consequences of Rick's behavior than the earlier seasons had sometimes been. Pickle Rick, which aired as the third episode of that season, became one of the most discussed and most celebrated episodes the show ever produced. It won a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program. It is the episode that gave the world the Pickle Rick meme, one of the most recognizable pieces of animated television shorthand of the entire decade. Pickle Rick was written by Jessica Gao. Jessica Gao was one of several new writers brought into the Rick and Morty writers' room for Season 3 as part of a deliberate effort by Dan Harmon and Justin Roiland to diversify the creative team. The room had been predominantly male in its earlier seasons. For Season 3, Harmon and Roiland made a conscious decision to bring in more female voices, reasoning that the show's emotional and psychological depth would benefit from a wider range of perspectives. Jane Becker was another writer added to the room during this period. Both Gao and Becker were experienced, credentialed writers who had worked on other shows before joining Rick and Morty. Their presence in the writers' room was not an experiment or a gesture. It was a creative decision made by the show's leadership on the basis of what they believed would make the show better. A segment of the Rick and Morty fan base responded to this decision with harassment. The harassment began after the credits of Season 3 episodes started appearing. When Rickmancing the Stone aired as the second episode of the season, its writing credit went to Jane Becker. When Pickle Rick aired third, its writing credit went to Jessica Gao. In both cases, a portion of the audience that had been watching those credits with a particular kind of attention reacted badly. The reaction was not limited to negative comments about the episodes themselves, though that was part of it. It escalated quickly into targeted personal harassment directed at both writers on Twitter. It escalated further into doxing. Doxing is the practice of researching and publicly publishing private information about a person, including home addresses, phone numbers, personal relationships, and other details that are not public record. It is done with the explicit purpose of making someone feel unsafe and vulnerable, and of signaling to them that the people who dislike them know where they live. Both Jane Becker and Jessica Gao were doxed by fans of a show they had been hired to write. The reasoning offered by the fans who participated in the harassment, to the extent that their communications contained anything identifiable as reasoning, rather than simply aggression, centered on the idea that the new female writers were responsible for changes in the show's tone and content that these fans found objectionable. The show had become, in their assessment, less purely comedic and more emotionally serious. It had become more interested in consequences and psychological depth. It had become, in a word that appeared repeatedly in the online spaces where this harassment organized itself, too soft. The implicit argument was that female writers had made a show that was built on transgressive comedy and nihilistic energy into something more concerned with feelings and meaning, and that this represented a corruption of something pure that had existed before them. This argument was wrong in almost every direction simultaneously. The emotional seriousness and psychological depth that these fans attributed to the female writers and resented as an intrusion was present in the show from its earliest episodes. The bird-person translation of Wubba Lubba Dub Dub that this essay examined in its opening section happened in Season 1, before the writers' room diversification. The suicide attempt at the end of autoerotic assimilation happened in Season 2, before the diversification. The show's willingness to sit with genuine emotional weight alongside its comedy was not a new direction introduced by new voices. It was a core feature of what Harmon and Roiland had been building from the beginning. The fans who blamed the female writers for a tonal shift that they disliked were misidentifying both the origin of the shift and the people responsible for it, and they were doing so in a way that conveniently directed their anger at the newest and most visible members of a team they could not otherwise easily target. Dan Harmon found out about the harassment through a Reddit thread that detailed what was happening. He was, by his own account, on a Twitter sabbatical at the time, and not actively monitoring the platform where much of the abuse was taking place. When he saw what was being done to his writers, he spoke publicly and at length about it in an interview with Entertainment Weekly. The language he used was unambiguous. He said he loathed the people doing it. He called the behavior disgusting. He described the structural dynamic underneath it, the way a certain kind of male online culture pats itself on the back for making women uncomfortable, as something he found genuinely reprehensible. He connected it to patterns he had observed in other contexts, including the harassment that writer and actress Felicia Day had experienced when she had spoken publicly about gaming culture, and noted that he had been aware going into Season 3 that bringing high-profile women into the show's public credits would expose them to exactly this kind of attack. That last detail deserves careful attention. Harmon knew before the season aired that his female writers were likely to face harassment. He had talked to Felicia Day about it. He had been warned by someone who had experienced it directly that this was what happened to women with public creative credits on shows with fan bases of this particular type. He brought Becker and Gao into the room anyway, which was the right decision creatively and ethically, and he condemned the harassment publicly when it happened, which was also the right thing to do. But the fact that he anticipated it and it happened anyway speaks to something about the specific culture that had grown up around Rick and Morty that went beyond what any individual creator's public statement could address or undo. The harassment of Becker and Gao was not a spontaneous eruption of random bad behavior from isolated individuals. It was organized to the extent that doxing requires organization. Finding and publishing private personal information about someone takes effort and coordination. The people who did it were not acting alone in isolated moments of passion.
They were participating in a collective activity that had specific targets, specific methods, and a specific ideological justification that centered on the idea that the show belonged to a certain kind of fan, and that the presence of certain kinds of creators represented an illegitimate intrusion on something those fans had decided was theirs. The irony of Pickle Rick specifically being the episode that Gao wrote is something that Harmon and others pointed out publicly at the time. Pickle Rick was celebrated by the very segment of the fan base most likely to be hostile to female writers as exactly the kind of content they wanted from the show. It was irreverent, it was violent, it was built around a transgressive premise and executed with technical precision. The edgelords, as Harmon put it in his EW interview, the fans who wanted the show to be a pure delivery system for transgressive comedy and resented any suggestion of emotional depth or consequence, had the woman they were harassing to thank for the episode they were most enthusiastically quoting. They were doxing the person who wrote the thing they loved most about the season they were complaining about. This contradiction was not persuasive to the people engaged in the harassment. It would not have been, because the harassment was not actually about the quality of the episodes or the direction of the show's tone. It was about something more basic and less rational than that. It was about who was allowed to be in the room. The presence of women with writing credits on a show this segment of the fan base had decided was theirs felt like a territorial violation. And the response to a territorial violation is not typically reasoned engagement with the merits of what the intruder has contributed. It is an attempt to make the intruder leave. Jessica Gao went on to create the Disney Plus series She-Hulk, Attorney at Law, which she served as head writer and showrunner. Her career after Rick and Morty demonstrated clearly that the harassment she received had not reflected any honest assessment of her talent or her value as a writer. It had reflected the attitudes of a group of people whose opinions about who deserved to make television had no relationship to the actual quality of what was being made. Jane Becker continued working in television as well. Her career also moved forward. The women who were targeted survived the targeting professionally, which is not always the outcome when this kind of sustained, organized harassment descends on someone in a creative industry. The psychological cost of being doxxed, of having strangers publish your home address on the internet because they dislike seeing your name in a television credit, is not something that career success erases. The fear that comes with that kind of targeting is specific and real and does not simply dissolve when the immediate harassment moves on to another target. Harmon's public condemnation of the harassment was genuine, and it was important in the sense that it used the platform he had to signal clearly that the behavior was not acceptable and was not something the show's creators endorsed or excused. But condemnation from a creator has limits as a tool for managing a fan base's worst elements. The people who harassed Becker and Gao were not waiting for Harmon's approval. They had already decided what they believed and what they were going to do about it. His statement told them he disagreed. It did not change the structure of the online spaces where the harassment was organized, did not remove the doxing information that had already been published, and did not prevent the same dynamics from reasserting themselves in subsequent situations involving the show and its audience. The writer's room harassment sat alongside the Szechuan sauce incident as part of a picture that was becoming increasingly difficult to look at without acknowledging what it showed. Rick and Morty had built one of the most devoted audiences in adult animation. That audience was, in the overwhelming majority of its members, enthusiastic and thoughtful and engaged with the show on the terms the show invited. The analysis and theorizing and deep reading that the fan community produced around Rick's character, around the show's mythology, around its emotional and philosophical content was genuinely impressive in aggregate. The earlier sections of this essay were built in part on the depth of that community's engagement. But the same show had also attracted, and in some ways cultivated, a segment of its audience that related to it through possession rather than appreciation. These were fans who believed the show belonged to them in a specific and exclusive sense, who responded to any perceived dilution or deviation from
what they considered the show's essential identity with aggression that could organize itself quickly and direct itself at specific targets. They had done it to Harmon and Roiland over the season 3 delay. They had done it to McDonald's over a condiment. They had done it to the female writers over a television credit. Each instance was different in its specifics and similar in its underlying structure. Dan Harmon, in his EW interview, said something that applies to all of these situations simultaneously. He said that if you are lucky enough to make a show that really good people like, it means some bad people are going to like it too, and that you cannot insist that everybody who watches your show gets their head on straight. This is an honest and accurate assessment of the situation. It is also, in the context of everything the show's fan base had done by the time he said it, a fairly significant understatement. Some of the bad people who liked Rick and Morty had organized themselves into a force capable of making specific individuals feel genuinely unsafe. The show had not created that capacity in them, but it had given them a shared identity and a shared object of devotion around which that capacity could organize itself and find expression. The writers' room harassment of 2017 was not the end of that story. It was a chapter in it. The show went on, the writers went on. The harassment eventually moved to other targets, in the way that online harassment always does, leaving behind it a changed writers' room in which the people who had been targeted now understood, with a specificity they had not had before, the potential cost of being publicly associated with a show whose most devoted and most hostile audience segment was watching the credits. That cost is real. It is not theoretical or hypothetical. It was paid by specific people whose names appeared on specific episodes and who received specific threats as a result. The Emmy that Pickle Rick won in 2018 belonged to Jessica Gao, in the same uncomplicated way that the harassment she received in 2017 had been directed at her. Both were responses to the same piece of work. The distance between them, between the television industry's highest honor and organized online intimidation aimed at the person who wrote the episode, is the distance that this particular moment in Rick and Morty's history contains within it, fully and without resolution. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That was the story of the writers' room, the harassment, the doxing, and the specific cruelty directed at the women behind some of the show's best work. Coming up next, we reach the final chapter, the new voices, the review bombing, the audience that rejected what came back, and the question of whether Rick and Morty survived losing the sound it was built on. Section 10, the new voices and the fallout. Season 7, review bombing, and the show without its creator. There is a specific kind of grief that comes with hearing a familiar voice replaced by an unfamiliar one. It is not a dramatic grief. It does not announce itself loudly or arrive with the weight of genuine loss. It is quieter than that. It is the small, disorienting feeling of reaching for something that has always been in a particular place and finding that the shape of it has changed. The thing is still there. It functions in most of the ways it always functioned, but something in the texture of it is different, and that difference registers in a place that is harder to locate than simple preference or aesthetic taste. It registers somewhere closer to memory, somewhere closer to the part of a person that associates certain sounds with certain feelings and certain periods of their life, and that notices, with a precision no critical framework can fully capture, when that association has been quietly severed. That is what happened to a significant portion of the Rick and Morty audience on October 15th, 2023, when Season 7 premiered on Adult Swim, with Ian Cardone voicing Rick Sanchez and Harry Belden voicing Morty Smith. Justin Roiland had voiced both characters for 10 years, across 6 complete seasons and the original short film that preceded the show. His voice was not incidental to the characters. It was the characters, in the most literal possible sense. Rick's particular rhythm, the way Roiland's performance moved between casual cruelty and sudden unexpected warmth, the specific quality of the belch that punctuated Rick's speech at irregular intervals, the stammer that Morty carried that made his anxiety feel textured rather than performed, all of it had been Roiland's creation and Roiland's alone for a decade. No other person had ever spoken those characters in a produced episode of the main series. When Season 7 began, someone else was speaking them for the first time. Adult Swim made a decision in the lead up to Season 7 that was unusual and, depending on how you assess it, either admirably principled or strategically questionable. The network chose not to reveal the names of the actors replacing Roiland until the season actually aired. The statement issued was that they wanted the show to speak for itself. They did not want the conversation about Season 7 to be dominated by comparisons between the new performers and the one they were replacing. They wanted audiences to encounter the new voices without preconceptions and to make their assessments based on what they heard rather than on who they had been told they were hearing. The reasoning behind this decision was understandable. Adult Swim was navigating a situation with no clean precedent in adult animation. The recasting of a show's lead characters, both of its lead characters simultaneously, under the circumstances that produced the recasting, was something that required careful handling. Keeping the actors' names private until air was an attempt to control the narrative and give the performances a fair hearing before the internet had the opportunity to organize its opinion around biographical facts rather than creative output. What the decision also did, less intentionally, was create a layer of strangeness around the Season 7 premiere that some viewers found unsettling. There was something odd about watching a show whose characters were being voiced by people whose names nobody was permitted to know. The anonymity felt less like artistic purity and more like institutional anxiety. It signaled, to an audience already primed by everything that had happened across 2023, that the network was not fully confident in the reception and was trying to manage it before it could organize. Whether or not that reading was fair, it contributed to the atmosphere of unease that surrounded the season's debut. Ian Cardone and Harry Belden were, by any objective assessment, remarkably capable replacements. Cardone's Rick was close enough to Roiland's performance that many viewers, on first listen, found themselves uncertain whether they were hearing a difference or imagining one. The belch was there, the rhythm was there, the tonal range, from contemptuous to vulnerable and back again, was present in Cardone's work with a consistency that spoke to serious preparation and genuine craft. Belden's Morty was similarly close, the stammer present, the emotional responsiveness intact, the specific quality of Morty's voice that makes him sound perpetually slightly overwhelmed by whatever is currently happening to him, rendered with enough accuracy that the character remained recognizable. These were not approximations. They were studied, skilled performances that respected what had come before, while finding enough of their own footing to function. The audience did not respond to these performances purely on their merits. The Rotten Tomatoes audience score for Season 7 arrived at 33%. 33. For comparison, Season 1 had a 97% audience score. Season 2 had 91. Season 3, the season that had attracted the writers' room harassment while producing the show's strongest creative work, had a 96% audience score. Season 6, the last season with Roiland, had an 81% audience score. That itself represented a slight dip from the earlier peaks. Season 7's 33% was not a gradual decline. It was a collapse. It was the show's most devoted rating community delivering a verdict that bore no mathematical relationship to the verdicts it had delivered in every previous season. The critical score told a different story. Professional critics, reviewing the episodes as episodes, gave Season 7 a 63% on Rotten Tomatoes, which made it the worst critically reviewed season in the show's history, but was still a passing grade that reflected a divided response rather than a consensus rejection. Critics noted the unevenness of the premiere. They noted that the new voices took adjustment. They noted that some of the jokes landed and some did not, which is true of every season, of every show. The critical response was the response of people watching a television show and assessing what it did and did not accomplish. The audience score was something else. The audience score was a response to the entire situation, to everything that 2023 had contained, delivered through the mechanism of a rating system in a way that made no distinction between the quality of the episodes and the grief and anger and disorientation that many viewers brought to them. This phenomenon of audiences using rating platforms to express responses that are not purely about the quality of the work being rated is called review bombing. It is a well-documented pattern in online entertainment culture. It occurs when a large number of people, motivated by factors that are external to the creative work itself, coordinate to drive a rating in a particular direction. The motivations can vary enormously. Sometimes review bombing is driven by political disagreement with a creator's public statements. Sometimes it is driven by controversy around casting decisions. Sometimes it is driven by dissatisfaction with a narrative direction that has nothing to do with the specific season being rated. In the case of Rick and Morty Season 7, the review bombing was driven by a mixture of genuine grief over the voice change, anger at Roiland's situation and what it had done to the show, and a generalized sense of displacement that the audience had nowhere more constructive to direct. Dan Harmon addressed the backlash in interviews given around the time of Season 7's premiere and in the weeks following. His approach was characteristically honest and characteristically resigned. He said that the internet had become so polarized that everything had to be either the absolute best or the absolute worst, with no territory in between where nuanced assessment could live. He said he had stopped looking the show up online as a way of protecting himself himself from the noise. He acknowledged that the recasting was a significant change, and that the audience's discomfort with it was real, while also expressing confidence in what Cardoni and Belden were bringing to the roles. He did not dismiss the negative response. He also did not pretend that the negative response was a fair, critical assessment of the season's creative quality. Chris Parnell, who voices Jerry Smith and who had spoken earlier about the demoralizing Zoom meeting during the uncertainty of early 2023, reflected on the season's reception in subsequent interviews with a combination of pride in what the team had produced and sadness about the circumstances under which it had been produced. The cast and crew had made something under conditions of genuine difficulty, had replaced the irreplaceable as carefully and skillfully as the situation allowed, and had delivered a season that was by most objective measures a functional and in places genuinely strong continuation of the show. The 33% audience score was not a reflection of what they had made. It was a reflection of what the year had cost everyone involved. The season itself, stripped of the context surrounding it and assessed purely on its own terms, was not a disaster. It was uneven in the way that transitions tend to be uneven. The premiere, titled How Poopy Got His Poop Back, was not among the show's strongest episodes. It centered on the return of Mr. Poopy Butthole rather than on Rick and Morty themselves, which some critics read as a deliberate choice to ease audiences into the new voices gradually, rather than leading with a Rick-heavy episode that would put the recasting immediately under a microscope. Whether this was intentional or simply a coincidence of the episode order is not established in the public record. What it produced was a premiere that felt slightly sideways from the show's center of gravity at a moment when the audience most needed to feel the show's weight directly. Later episodes in the season recovered more of that weight. The Unmortrican episode, which delivered the long-awaited confrontation between Rick C-137 and Rick Prime, and finally gave Evil Morty his origin story, was received as one of the season's strongest entries, and by some fans as one of the strongest episodes the show had produced in years. It demonstrated that the narrative ambition that had made Rick and Morty compelling across its run was intact. The writers were still capable of paying off long-running storylines with emotional precision. The new voices, by that point in the season, had settled into something that felt less like replacement and more like continuation. The adjustment that viewers needed time to make was happening across the season in real time, for the portion of the audience that was watching with genuine openness, rather than with a verdict already decided. The question of whether Rick and Morty survived the loss of its founding voice is one that depends significantly on what you mean by survive. The show continued. It maintained a production schedule. It delivered episodes that were written with the same care and produced with the same animation quality as what had come before. The narrative continued moving forward. The characters of Rick Sanchez and Morty Smith remained on screen, voiced by people who had studied and respected the originals and were doing the work with evident skill and dedication. In all of these structural senses, the show survived. What is harder to assess, and what the 33% audience score gestures toward without fully capturing, is whether the show retained the specific quality that had made it matter to people in the way that it had. That quality was not reducible to any single element. It was a combination of the writing and the animation and the narrative ambition and the voice performances, and the feeling that all of these things had been assembled by people who were genuinely trying to make something worth caring about. Roiland's voice was one component of that combination. His departure removed one component. Whether the combination still produced the same result without that component is a question that individual viewers answered differently, and that no aggregate score can settle definitively. What is clear is that the show's relationship with its audience was permanently altered by everything that the period between January 2023 and October 2023 contained. The charges, the severance, the wider allegations, the recasting, the anonymity decision, the premiere, the scores. Each of these things left a mark on the relationship between Rick and Morty and the people who had loved it. And marks of that kind do not simply disappear when the next season arrives with better reviews or a stronger premiere. They become part of the history of the thing. They become part of what the thing is, in the way that everything a show has been through becomes part of what it is. Rick and Morty is a show about a character who went through something terrible, rebuilt himself around the loss, and then spent years performing a version of himself that was not entirely honest about what the rebuilding had cost. He kept moving. He kept generating noise and adventure and chaos to fill the space where the original thing had been. The people around him could feel that something was different, even when they could not name exactly what. The performance was convincing enough that it mostly held, but underneath it, the shape of the wound was always visible to anyone paying close enough attention. The show itself, after 2023, found itself in a structurally similar position. It kept moving. It kept generating episodes and storylines storylines, and the specific brand of intelligent chaos that had defined it from the beginning. The new voices settled, the writing maintained its ambition, the production continued. But underneath all of that continuation, the shape of what had been lost was visible in the audience scores and in the interviews and in the way people talked about the show, with a kind of past tense tenderness that had not been present when Roiland was still the voice in the recording booth. That tenderness is not nothing. It is, in its own way, a form of love. The same love that made the sauce riots happen, and the same love that made people spend hours writing theories about Rick's nihilism, and the same love that had carried the show through 10 years and multiple controversies and one of the most difficult transitions in adult animation history. Rick and Morty had always been a show about people who loved each other badly and imperfectly and sometimes harmfully, who kept coming back anyway because the alternative was being alone with whatever they were carrying. The audience that stayed through season 7 and beyond was doing something recognizable from inside the show itself. They were coming back imperfectly, with grief still present, because the thing they loved was still there in some form, still recognizable, still trying, and that, for a certain kind of viewer, was enough. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.